Hello there, my name is David Pustansky and welcome to ExtremeImprov TV's review of this game, RetroMania Wrestling. So, if you are a long-term fan of professional wrestling video games, you may be familiar with the legendary arcade game WrestleFest. This was the WWF WrestleFest game that came out, I think, in the very early 1990s. Frequently regarded as one of the greatest arcade wrestling games of all time, and is also still within the conversation of best wrestling games of all time overall. The game was bright, bold, and over the top. These attributes completely captured everything fans loved about the WWF at the time, but it was unfortunate that whilst WrestleFest was a hit with fans in the arcades, it was a case that contemporary consoles at the time were not up to the challenge of a port of WrestleFest. Instead, we got some very average and graphically incomparable NES games, and the closest we got to a port of WrestleFest at the time came in WrestleMania for the Amiga 500, Atari ST, and perhaps PC. I'm not sure if it came out on the PC at the time. Licenses have changed hand multiple times over the years since then, and by the time that consoles caught up with what the arcade could produce, the WWF games had long since moved on from WrestleFest. Roll forward some 30 years, and that is where RetroMania Wrestling comes in. A game that was first revealed by the YouTuber RTG85 a couple of years ago. This game has built up a following, and it's told its development story by building a community of excited fans around it. The initial idea was simply to be a spiritual successor to the WWF game that the developers, Retrosoft Studios, had loved playing themselves in the early 90s. Those following the game's development will know from its initial idea, the game has since gone on to become an official sequel to WrestleFest, and along the way has gained a lot of connections within the pro wrestling industry, and has become quite a highly anticipated release for wrestling and gaming fans. Now, graphically speaking, the game is very close to what you'd get in WrestleFest back in the day, with the big, bold, over-the-top cartoonish graphics on all of the wrestlers. And it's this modern retro approach which has now become an art style rather than just based on a limitation at the time. Now, I played this game in handheld mode on the Nintendo Switch, and I can say that the graphics look really great here. However, when I've played it on my big screen television, I do feel that they looked a tiny bit pixelated, and of course, when you come to the on-screen text in story mode, sometimes it is just a little bit blurry, and they do have something where it looks wavy, and that didn't quite work for me in terms of being able to always comfortably read it. On the handheld though, it's great, and look, here I am on the end credits, didn't even realise when I was bringing this up to show you. The game is rich with detail and references for wrestling fans to enjoy. Each of the wrestlers in the game has their own themed arena, and a particular favourite is the Major Figure Wrestling podcast arena, which looks exactly like the Hasbro WWF figure ring. Including things like this completely play into their target audience's likes. As quite a coincidence, this week I've also got a review up on the Extreme.tv website of this classic style Cella Toys Nick Aldis Hasbro style wrestling action figure, so check that out. If you're a die-hard wrestling fan, you'll also enjoy the references to the industry, with the story mode referencing that established veterans will hold down younger talents, and the past history of the ECW alumni featured in the game, such as Tommy Dreamer and the BWO, that they have that with each other, and also the inclusion of Dave Meltzer and Bill Apter, and also the guy that runs the Pro Wrestling Tees, so good for him for getting in on the game. Now, the attention to detail is good, but one criticism I do have in this fact is that this level of fan service is perhaps a little bit detrimental and a little bit too heavily relying on people being hardcore wrestling fans. It's most noticeable when you come to the roster of the game, which I am going to dig into one by one. As a super hardcore wrestling fan, I really like that it's got this very varied roster, but having wrestlers from different eras, different promotions, and different star levels does feel a little bit like a bit of a mishmash rather than that one focused vision of building a roster to satisfy one particular group of fans. When the game was first announced, it was announced that the game would include the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, RIP Animal, who we recently lost during the development of this game. and their inclusion is great both in terms of star power and the fact that they were the original WrestleFest main bosses that you defeat at the end of the game. It does feel a bit of a shame that they were the only wrestlers from the original game to be brought back here, but this may largely be down to rights issues. I've seen that the developers have mentioned on Twitter that they wanted to include Demolition, but it just, for whatever reason, did not work out. Hulk Hogan obviously is currently under contract with the WWE, and it's probable that Sergeant Slaughter and the $1 Million Man have Legends contracts. Jake the Snake Roberts is currently with All Elite Wrestling, and the rest of the roster on the original game, WrestleFest, are made up of Earthquake, Mr. Perfect, the Big Boss Man, and the Ultimate Warrior, all of whom have passed away, and in all of those cases, those gimmick names, if nothing else, are owned by the WWE. So, as you can see, bringing back the other wrestlers beyond the Road Warriors may have been tricky. Still, it's perhaps would have been quite good if they'd included some other WWF wrestlers from the era. We do have Austin Idol, who wrestled in the 1980s, but not prominently for the WWF. Although fans of the NWA will recognise him from the recent NWA Power shows. And lastly, from the era in which the original WrestleFest came out, we also have Nikita Koloff, who was quite a big star for the NWA and WCW, but again didn't wrestle for the WWF. With this being RetroMania Wrestling, and now the official sequel to WrestleFest, not official in the sense that they got the rights from WWE, but they bought the rights from the company that originally produced WrestleFest. It does feel a missed opportunity not to have more wrestlers from the 80s and 90s, as fans who are older and love that era may feel a little bit lost on some of the next inclusions that I'm about to cover. And yes, I do know that this is all very easy for me to say without having any idea about how much it would have cost to have got in other stars or what the contract negotiations, or without knowing, other than that they'd mentioned Demolition, who else they reached out to. But imagine if this game did include the likes of Rick Rude, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Coco Beware, Honky Tonk Man, Junkyard Dog. There's a whole list of names which I'd like to see included in this game in future updates with download content, and I think all of the names I said there are quite possible in that I don't think that they're currently signed to Legends contracts. Some of them aren't with us anymore, so maybe the family can still get the rights to put out these wrestlers. Who knows? Time will tell. Next up on the roster we have Tommy Dreamer and the BWO, Stevie Richards, Hollywood Nova, and the Blue Meanie, who are most famously associated with ECW. Of course, all three have been in the WWE as well as other places, with Tommy Dreamer still being an active part of the industry, wrestling and working currently for Impact. Tommy Dreamer also currently runs House of Hardcore, and that promotion is prominently featured in the game with its own arena. It is cool to have 4 ECW guys in the game, but with 3 of them being what is the BWO, it is easy just to see them, the unit, as one entity, and in this sense it would have perhaps been good to have a little bit of variety in which ECW wrestlers were in it, such as RVD, Sabu, the Sandman, and then Tommy Dreamer. Not to say not to include the BWO, but they would have felt like 4 different unique individuals, whereas the BWO is obviously a unit. We then have more modern and recent wrestlers famous for their stints in WWE. These are John Morrison, Zack Ryder, and Kurt Hawkins, who, due to WWE owning the rights to those names, are in this game called Johnny Retro, Matt Cordona, and Brian Myers, respectively. Of course, in the case of Cordona and Myers, these are their real names and the names that they currently use wrestling on the Independents and in Impact Wrestling. With Johnny Retro, who is now actually back in the WWE and therefore the most publicly visible member of this roster, his name, Johnny Retro, in this game is actually a continuation of the many names he's had over the years that have referenced promotions that he's worked for. This started with him being called Johnny Nitro, whilst being the protege of Eric Bischoff on WWE. Eric Bischoff obviously is famous for running WCW, and their show was called WCW Nitro. He was then known as Johnny Impact in Impact Wrestling, so for him to be called Johnny Retro, similar to Johnny Nitro, just continues this theme. All of these current wrestlers are good inclusions for current fans to be able to play as, and it would be great to see some more contemporary stars known for their time in WWE added as DLC later down the line. Of course, we do have some more current generation wrestlers in the game, and one of the things that's good about their inclusion is that their careers are still ongoing, and so because their careers are taking shape, they may later turn out to be as big as the Ultimate Warrior or Sergeant Slaughter in the original WrestleFest. Who knows? Nick Aldis is the current NWA World's Heavyweight Champion and also a World Champion in TNA Wrestling. Clearly he was a big get for the game, as it also gave the game its £10 of gold championship mode, where you end up challenging Aldis as a boss character to become the world's champion. Colt Cabana is currently in AEW's Dark Order and was also a part of the NWA recently. He did have a forgettable run in the WWE as Scotty Goldman, but Cabana is the king of the indies and, like Aldis, has gained his level of fame without the WWE. Rounding out the launch roster is Jeff Cobb, Warhorse and Zack Sabre Jr. Cobb, who made a couple of appearances for AEW to wrestle Jon Moxley, is more known for his time in Ring of Honor and New Japan Pro Wrestling. Next up we have Warhorse, who famously wrestled Cody Rhodes for the AEW TNT Championship last year, and is an up-and-coming indie star who has a retro-style Ultimate Warrior, Road Warrior-ish gimmick. Warhorse is notable for being in the game after the developers ran their Indie Mania competition to include a indie star on the game, and Warhorse got the most fan support. Warhorse got the most support, and that is because Warhorse rules ass! Lastly, Zack Sabre Jr. is a British wrestler currently signed to New Japan Pro Wrestling, and anyone who's been watching any of their shows will know that he's one of the best technical wrestlers in the world today. So overall, the developers can be proud of a great mix of eras and companies represented, but as I mentioned earlier, it may be a little too unfocused and disconnected for many wrestling fans who are of the casual variety. If the roster was double the size, with this split across different promotions and time periods, it would actually be a lot better, as there would be a sense of various warring factions. But hopefully, DLC will remedy all of this. It's already announced that Mr. Hughes, James Storms and Chris Bay will be added as DLC, and time will tell who else may be added down the line. So after that in-depth analysis of the main roster, let's get on with the gameplay, as ultimately it doesn't matter if you have a WWE level roster if you put out a WWE 2K19 level game. Fortunately, the game here plays great. The game plays very similar but not exactly like WrestleFest. The game gives you weak, medium and strong attacks, and approaching your opponent will trigger a grapple, which can lead to different moves depending which level of attack button you press combined with a different direction button on the D-pad. I thought that it was fun to experiment to see the different moves that the different wrestlers can do, and I was quickly finding out which strategy worked for me to dominate my opponents. Also, the variety of grappling, strikes and ground moves worked well to create fun to watch arcade wrestling matches. Each of the wrestlers have varying movesets, which gives incentive to play through the game multiple times to see each of them take the NWA World title from Nick Aldis. As it is, you can't actually play as Nick Aldis to challenge for the £10 of gold, which is a little bit of a shame, because a palette swap ring attire would have made it possible and would have been a fun inclusion if you're a fan of Aldis and would like to play as him. Also on that note, the story mode only allows you to play as Johnny Retro currently. It would be good to see all of the wrestlers get a story mode in the future, and even if it was just that they get to play through a story mode of some sort and then get an ending screen like you would on Street Fighter, where it just tells you something about, now that this person is champion, whatever they're going to do. Remember what happens at the end of WrestleMania, the arcade game, with the really weird end sequences? Something like that might be cool. In my playthrough of the story mode, I got a to be continued screen, which I was a little confused by. I found it a bit surprising because the story itself suggested that there was going to be at least one final boss fight. Now, I won't give any what is probably minor spoilers to the story here for what happened or why I expected it to have another fight, but I do feel like there is some explanation that needs to be made as to why it ended on a to be continued screen. If there's going to be an update later or some sort of season pass or something, they perhaps should clarify that, and probably should clarify it in-game, because it's weird for a wrestling game to end on to be continued. In addition to regular matches, you also get tag, multi-man tag matches, 4 counts anywhere matches and cage matches. And of course you get the Retro Rumble mode, which echoes back to the Royal Rumble mode in WrestleFest. All of these are fun to play, and whilst I did feel like I'd seen most of what the game currently has to offer within a few hours, it's worth remembering that this is designed to be an arcade wrestling game. So the short length isn't necessarily a bad thing and is actually to be expected. There are a few things I would like to see improved upon in the gameplay in future updates. For example, if you attempt to pin a downed opponent or put them in a submission hold and you don't win from it, you will get knocked down to the ground onto the mat, and that will actually give your opponent the opportunity to put you in a hold or pin you. This might have been true of WrestleFest. I haven't played it in a little while to be able to say that, but I seem to remember that you could get kicked out of and then be knocked down yourself. But it was just a little bit annoying that I actually once lost a match because someone knocked me down out of kicking out and then they were able to pin me, and that doesn't feel like that's good logic to be able to happen. Also, it felt like grabbing a steel chair on the game can sometimes put you at a disadvantage, as it's easy to pick up a chair either by mistake or that opponents could easily dodge a chair shot and grab you into a grapple when you have a chair, and you'd think that would give you the advantage. But these are only minor points, and these thoughts for improvements to gameplay are hardly deal breakers. As it stands, these just meant that I changed my strategy so that I don't go for a pin until I think that I'm ready to win, and I don't use steel chairs that much at all. The music in the game is also very retro in style, which fits everything else about the presentation, and the game does include commentary and limited amounts of voiceover work. These sound suitably retro in their quality, and I'll be honest, I wouldn't have minded if these had sounded slightly sharper or if there was extra commentary in there. Also, it was fun to see Nick Aldis doing the promos in the 10 pounds of gold mode, and they get bonus points for the recreation of Hulk Hogan smashing the countdown numbers in the championship mode, just like in WrestleFest. Except for in this one, it's Hollywood Nova replacing Hollywood Hogan. So, in conclusion, overall, I think RetroMania Wrestling is a really solid arcade wrestling game. It knows exactly who it's for, and it plays to that audience really well. A few gameplay tweaks would be great in an update, and the roster is good in ways but lacks a clear direction to appeal to casual wrestling fans. But most importantly, the gameplay is a lot of fun, and I can see this being a game that wrestling fans will return to over and over again for years to come, for bursts of retro-inspired wrestling action. So for more gaming videos, gaming articles, do check out the Extreme Improv YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/ExtremeImprov. If you could click a like and smash that subscribe button, that would be absolutely brilliant. And of course, head over to extreme.tv for lots of wrestling articles every single week. And of course, if you're a wrestling fan, do check out our comedy panel show themed all around pro wrestling. It's called the Slam Jam Wrestling Show and comes on every week on the Extreme Improv YouTube channel. So, from me, until next time, stay safe, stay extremed, and always stay retro. Boom.